Wyoming Territory, December 1886. The wind howled so hard it seemed to tear the world apart, and Florence O'Doyle knew she might die out here. Snow whipped across the open prairie, blinding and bitter, as she stumbled forward, clutching her newborn daughter tight against her chest. Her boots sank deep into the drifts, her skirts soaked and heavy, her body aching from childbirth only a few hours ago. She had no idea where she was anymore, only that the wagon her husband had abandoned her from was miles behind, and she had to keep moving. Little Eliza whimpered against her, the only warmth Florence had left. She pressed a trembling kiss to her baby's forehead and whispered, "I will not let you die, sweetheart. I swear it." Her feet caught a hidden rock, and she tumbled hard into the snow. She barely had strength to rise. The cold gnawed at her bones, and blackness flickered at the edges of her vision. "Help!" she rasped, even though she knew nobody could hear her. "Please!" the blizzard roared back in answer. She closed her eyes, shielding Eliza with her body. She thought of her father's farm in Ohio, of warm kitchens and the smell of fresh bread. She thought of all she had lost when she had run away with a man she barely knew. Regret was a heavy thing. When Florence opened her eyes again, she thought she was dreaming. A figure on horseback loomed through the whiteout, his coat and hat dusted with snow, his horse struggling against the wind. He spotted her and swung down fast, boots crunching through the drifts. His gloved hands were gentle as he knelt beside her. "Miss, can you hear me?" His voice was rough but urgent. She nodded weakly, too cold to speak. He peeled back the edge of her blanket, saw the tiny face tucked against her, and his whole body tensed. "God Almighty," he muttered. "Hold on. I have you." Without waiting for permission, he gathered Florence and Eliza into his arms, lifting them like they weighed nothing. She felt the warmth of his body through her frozen skirts, smelled leather and wood smoke clinging to him. He boosted her into the saddle ahead of him, wrapping his coat around them both. Florence sagged back against his chest, too exhausted to do anything but trust him. "Name's Gideon Zane," he said close to her ear, his voice a lifeline in the storm. "You are safe now." The horse fought through the blizzard, Gideon guiding it with steady hands. Florence could hear him murmuring words of encouragement to the animal, felt his arms tighten protectively around her and Eliza every time the wind hit harder. She wanted to say thank you, to tell him she would find some way to repay him, but the words would not come. The world blurred into white and gray, and then, at last, a dark shape took form, a small cabin half buried in snow. Gideon swung down, carrying Florence and the baby to the door. He kicked it open with his boot, the hinges groaning, and carried them inside. Warmth hit her like a blow. A fire crackled in the hearth, and heavy quilts were piled on a rough-hewn bed. Gideon set her down with incredible care, his face tight with worry. "You are half frozen," he said. He pulled off his gloves and hat, revealing dark hair and a rugged, handsome face lined from years in the sun. His hands were already working to peel off her wet coat and boots, his movements brisk but gentle. "We need to get you warm right now." Eliza whimpered again, a thin, pitiful sound. Gideon moved fast, throwing more wood on the fire until it roared, then fetching a battered kettle to heat water. He found a soft shirt from his own things and handed it to Florence. "Get out of those wet clothes, madam," he said. "I will not look. I swear it." Florence tried to undress, but her fingers would not obey. Seeing her struggle, Gideon cursed under his breath. "Forgive me," he said roughly. He turned his back but reached behind him to help, guiding her arms free with careful hands, never looking. He helped her into the dry shirt, wrapping her in quilts until she was cocooned in warmth. Florence pressed Eliza closer, feeling sensation creep painfully back into her limbs. Gideon knelt beside the bed, his face grim. "Is the baby hurt?" Florence shook her head. "Just cold. Like me." Relief softened his features. He reached out, then hesitated, his hand hovering just above her shoulder. "You are safe now," he said again, softer this time. "I will take care of you both." Tears filled Florence's eyes. No one had said words like that to her in so long, not without expectation, not without cruelty hidden behind them. "Thank you," she whispered. He smiled, a real warm smile that lit up his whole face. "You do not need to thank me," Gideon said. "Just rest." Florence watched him move around the cabin, stoking the fire, boiling water, setting out bread and dried meat. He worked with quiet efficiency, glancing at her and Eliza every few minutes as if to make sure they were still breathing. Safe. She was safe. The thought broke something loose inside her, and for the first time in months, Florence let herself cry. Silent tears slid down her cheeks as she cradled Eliza close. Gideon saw but said nothing. He just tucked another quilt around her shoulders and sat nearby, keeping vigil through the night. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the little cabin was a world apart, warm and alive. Florence did not know this man, did not know where she was or what would happen next. But for the first time in a long, long while, she had hope. Gideon's cabin smelled of pine resin and old tobacco, the corners shadowed with winter's early dusk. Florence lay still beneath the quilts as Eliza slept against her chest, the baby's tiny breath puffing warm against her skin. Her body ached in every place, but the sharpest pain was hunger gnawing at her belly. Gideon sat by the fire, carving at a strip of wood with a small knife, the steady scrape filling the silence. He hadn't spoken much since settling her in, but there was no sense of distance to him, just a quiet patience, like he was giving her time to find her feet. When Florence shifted to sit up, the movement caught his eye. He set aside the carving without a word and crossed the room to pour some of the hot water into a battered tin cup. He mixed it with a pinch of dried herbs from a pouch by the hearth, then handed it to her without meeting her gaze. "It ain't much, but it'll help warm you," he said. She accepted it with trembling fingers, the cup so hot it stung. She sipped carefully, the bitter drink scraping her raw throat. Grateful for the warmth, she cradled it in both hands, careful not to jostle Eliza. Gideon crouched by a chest against the wall, rummaging through its contents until he found a folded bundle. He unwrapped a coarse cloth to reveal a small loaf of bread and a wedge of hard cheese. He tore a piece free, set it on a tin plate, and placed it within her reach. "I'll hunt tomorrow," he said. "Meat'll do you better than old bread." Florence forced her voice out, low and hoarse. "This is more than I expected." He gave a short shake of his head. "Ain't right, a woman and child left to die in the snow. Whatever fool left you out there ought to be hanged." She lowered her eyes, shame burning hotter than the fire. The man who had abandoned her wasn't worth defending, but the truth of her situation weighed heavy. Gideon must have seen the flicker of pain cross her face, because his voice softened. "You don't owe me an explanation." Florence tightened her hold on Eliza. "We were supposed to be heading for Montana." She faltered, the words scraping her throat rawer than the cold ever had. "He decided we weren't worth the trouble anymore." Gideon didn't say anything right away. He moved to toss another log on the fire, the sparks jumping as the flames caught. When he spoke again, his voice was low, steady. "You're worth a hell of a lot more than he ever was, I reckon." She blinked hard against the sting in her eyes, focusing on the steady sound of the fire instead of the weight of his words. The baby stirred, fussing weakly. Florence shifted, trying to soothe her, but her arms were shaking too badly. Without asking, Gideon stepped close and offered his hands. "May I?" he asked. Nervousness knotted in her chest, but something steady in his gaze made her nod. Carefully, he slid his arms under Eliza, lifting her with surprising ease. He cradled the baby close, his broad hands supporting her tiny body like he'd held a newborn 100 times before. "She's a strong little thing," he said, studying Eliza's wrinkled face with something like wonder. Florence swallowed hard. "Her name's Eliza." Gideon smiled, slow and genuine. "Hello there, Miss Eliza. You sure gave your mama a hard road to walk, didn't you?" Eliza hiccuped, her tiny mouth working in an uncoordinated grimace. Gideon chuckled low in his throat, the sound rumbling against the cabin walls. "She's hungry," Florence said, reaching out. "I should," but Gideon was already handing her back, careful and deliberate. She shifted beneath the quilts to nurse, her cheeks coloring with modesty, but Gideon had already turned his back and busied himself with the fire again, granting her privacy without making a show of it. The minutes stretched quiet and slow. The blizzard outside battered against the walls, but here inside there was only the crackle of the fire, the soft sigh of the baby, and Gideon's steady movements. When Eliza finally drifted back to sleep, Florence wrapped her tightly and laid her in a shallow wooden box near the hearth, padded with folded blankets. Gideon had turned it over and lined it carefully while she fed the baby, making a makeshift cradle without a word. Florence brushed her hair back from her face, suddenly aware of how tangled and grimy she must look. She caught Gideon watching her from the corner of his eye, his expression unreadable. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," he said finally. "A storm like this might not break for days." She opened her mouth to protest, pride pricking at her, but the truth was she had nowhere to go. She nodded once, tightly. "Thank you." Gideon shifted his weight, glancing toward the door as if measuring the thickness of the snow outside. "Cabin's small, but I'll sleep by the fire," he said. "You and the little one take the bed." Florence hesitated. "I can sleep by the fire." "You've already done enough." "No," his voice was firm but not unkind. "You need the warmth more than I do." She looked at him across the room, at the way he stood so solidly, hands loose at his sides, offering help without asking anything back. For the first time in months, she felt the faintest stir of safety touch her heart. Gideon bent to unroll a thick wool blanket for himself, spreading it by the hearth. He moved with the ease of a man used to making do, not expecting comfort. Florence climbed back into the bed carefully, pulling the quilts up to her chin. She lay there in the flickering firelight, watching Gideon settle in. Outside, the storm raged on, merciless and wild. Inside, Florence closed her eyes and let herself believe that, somehow, they would see morning together. Dawn broke sullen and gray, the storm warned to a restless wind that rattled the shutters. Florence blinked into the dim light, disoriented for a moment until the scent of smoke and the low crackle of the fire reminded her where she was. Eliza stirred in her makeshift cradle, her small fists waving weakly in the air. Gideon was already up. He stood near the hearth, his back to her, fastening a battered leather belt around his coat. A long rifle leaned against the wall within easy reach. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if he had long made habits of readiness. Florence pulled herself upright, the quilts falling from her shoulders. Her muscles protested, but she ignored them, slipping from the bed to check on Eliza. The baby was warm, her cheeks flushed with healthy color. Relief washed through Florence, strong enough to bring a brief tremble to her knees. Gideon turned at the sound of her movement. His gaze swept over her, assessing without prying. "I'm heading out to set snares," he said. "Won't go far. You'll be all right here." She tucked the blanket snug around Eliza before answering. "Yes, we'll be fine." He nodded once. "There's water heating if you want to wash up. Some clean things in the chest there." He jerked his chin toward a low, battered trunk. "They'll be big on you, but dry." Florence crossed the room and knelt beside the chest. The wood was rough under her hands as she lifted the lid. Inside lay neatly folded shirts and trousers, worn but clean. She chose a soft linen shirt and a heavy wool skirt, grateful beyond words. She glanced up to find Gideon watching her, his face unreadable. "You'll need boots come thaw," he said. "Yours won't hold much longer." She looked down at her cracked, frost-stiffened boots and nodded, shame prickling her skin. She hated feeling like a burden. "I can sew," she offered, her voice steady despite the twist in her stomach. "Mend clothes, patch harnesses. I'll earn my keep." Gideon shrugged into a thick coat and picked up the rifle. "Ain't about earning it. Folk help each other when they can." He opened the door, letting in a slice of cold so sharp it made Florence shiver. Before stepping out, he paused. "You're not alone anymore, Florence." Then he was gone, the door thudding shut behind him. She stood there a long moment, the words hanging in the warm air. Not alone. For so long, she had carried everything alone, the fear, the hunger, the weight of choices she could not undo. To hear someone say it plain, with no expectation, rattled her more than the storm ever had. She dressed quickly, the oversized clothes hanging loose on her frame. The skirt dragged a little, but it was warmer than anything she had owned for months. She braided her hair back from her face with stiff fingers, feeling each tug ground her a little more firmly in the present. Eliza fussed, and Florence lifted her from the cradle, tucking her into the sling she fashioned from a spare shawl. She moved carefully around the cabin, tidying where she could, her body still sluggish but her mind alert. The hearthstone was dusty. She found a rag and wiped it clean. A stack of chipped plates leaned precariously on a shelf. She straightened them. There were small things she could do, and doing them made the tightness in her chest ease a little. By the time Gideon returned, his boots thudding heavy against the porch, Florence had coaxed a pot of thin porridge to life over the fire. She met him at the door, lifting the latch before he could knock the snow from his coat. He stepped inside, stamping his boots. His face was raw from the cold, but he smiled when he saw her standing there, Eliza snug against her chest. "Cabin's lookin' homier already," he said, setting a pair of rabbits down on the table. Florence lowered her gaze, heat rising to her cheeks. "I thought it was the least I could do." Gideon shrugged out of his coat and hung it on a peg by the door. "Least you could do is rest. But I ain't complaining." She stirred the porridge and ladled some into a tin bowl, setting it before him with a wooden spoon. He sat heavily on the bench by the table, accepting it with a nod of thanks. As he ate, Florence sat opposite him, bouncing Eliza gently in her arms. The silence between them was companionable, broken only by the clink of the spoon against the bowl. After a while, Gideon leaned back, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "You got folks somewhere?" he asked. Florence hesitated, then shook her head. "Not anymore." He studied her, his brow furrowed slightly. "You aim to keep heading west once the weather breaks?" She tightened her hold on Eliza. The idea of trying to cross the mountains again, cold and desperate, filled her with dread. "I don't know," she admitted. "I just want her to have a chance." Gideon was quiet a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice was low. "I've got land here. Not much, but enough. Cabin needs fixing. Fences, too. Could use help." Florence's heart thudded painfully against her ribs. "I don't expect nothin' in return you don't want to give," he added quickly. "But you're welcome to stay. As long as you want." She looked at him across the rough wooden table, at the man who had pulled her from the teeth of a blizzard without knowing her name. At the man who spoke of help and home without asking for payment. Eliza made a soft, contented sound against her chest. Florence reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand lightly. His skin was rough with calluses, warm against the chill in hers. "Thank you, Gideon," she said, her voice steady. "I'd like that." He turned his hand over, gently curling his fingers around hers. Outside, the wind still sighed across the prairie. But inside the cabin, hope took root, fragile and stubborn and real. The day settled into a quiet rhythm. The snow packed firm against the cabin walls, but inside, life pressed on. Florence mended the torn seams of Gideon's coats and stitched patches onto worn shirts, her needle flashing steady under the dim afternoon light. Eliza, swaddled and content, slept in the crook of her arm or the cradle Gideon had fashioned sturdier with scraps of pine, he planed smooth by hand. One afternoon, as Florence knelt by the hearth scraping the last of the porridge from the pot, Gideon returned from the woods, a brace of grouse slung over his shoulder. His cheeks were wind-chafed, and a thin line of blood marked a tear in his shirt. "You're hurt," Florence said, rising swiftly. He waved a hand, his voice casual. "Brush with a thorn bush is all." Bird flushed harder than I figured. Florence set Eliza in the cradle and crossed to him, reaching for his sleeve. Gideon hesitated, then let her guide him to the chair by the fire. She tore a strip from a worn undershirt and dampened it with warm water, working to clean the cut. His skin was rough beneath her fingers, but he sat still, letting her tend him. "You've been alone here a long time," she said, voice low. He glanced at her, something unspoken passing between them. "Since my brother passed. Land was his to start with. I stayed after." Florence smoothed the cloth over the wound, careful not to press too hard. "I'm sorry. He took sick fast. Fever that winter near 10 years back. Nothing to be done." Gideon's voice was even, but the way he stared into the fire told her the grief had never truly left him. She tied the cloth snug and sat back on her heels. "You stayed because it's home." He nodded once. "Ain't much, but it's mine." Florence folded the damp rag, placing it neatly in the wash basin. She smoothed her skirt and stood, feeling the weight of his gaze follow her. "You could leave, he said. "Come spring, you could head for town, find work. Plenty of places in Cheyenne or Laramie that'd take on a woman with sharp hands." Florence turned, meeting his eyes across the small room. "Is that what you want?" He shook his head slowly. "And about what I want. Thought you ought to know you have choices." She crossed to the cradle and lifted Eliza, cradling her close. The baby stirred, blinking up at her with unfocused eyes. Florence pressed a kiss to her soft hair, breathing in the clean, milky scent. "I don't want to leave," she said, voice steady. "Eliza needs a place to grow. I need a place to belong." Gideon rose from the chair, his movements deliberate. He crossed the room until he stood before her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him. "You belong here if you want it," he said. Florence searched his face, finding nothing but quiet certainty there. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I want it," she whispered. Gideon reached out, his hand tentative, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. His fingers lingered, tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her throat tighten. "I reckon we could build something real here," he said. "You, me, the little one." Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wanted to see him clearly. "I'd like that more than anything," she said. He leaned in, giving her time to pull away if she wished. She didn't. His lips met hers, gentle and sure, the kiss warm and steady like everything else about him. Florence closed her eyes, letting herself fall into it, into him, into the life they could build together. When they parted, Gideon rested his forehead against hers, his hand cradling the back of her neck. "We'll do right by you both," he said softly. Florence smiled, a real smile that reached all the way to her heart. "I believe you," she said. Outside, the wind still sang across the plains, but inside, the cabin was filled with a new kind of warmth, one born not just of fire, but of hope and of love that had been fought for and found. By the time winter loosened its grip, the land around the cabin had shifted from endless white to patches of stubborn brown earth. Florence stood on the small porch with Eliza bundled against her chest, watching Gideon drive the last fence post into the thawing ground. His shirt clung to his back with the effort, but he moved with steady purpose, his shoulders broad against the pale sky. Florence shifted Eliza slightly and called out, "You'll wear yourself thin if you don't stop for a bite." Gideon straightened and leaned on the post driver, grinning at her in a way that made her heart lift. "Finish in this corner first. Then I'll come in." She laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar but welcome in her own ears. It felt good to laugh again, to feel the days stretch ahead with something other than fear. The cabin had changed in small ways over the past weeks. Gideon had built a second cradle with stronger joints and a hand-carved rail. Florence had pieced together curtains from old flour sacks and stitched a quilt from scraps Gideon unearthed from a trunk. Each stitch and nail added something invisible but real, a sense of belonging. That evening, after supper, Gideon brought out a battered wooden box from under the bed. He set it carefully on the table and opened it, revealing a small stack of papers, a bottle of ink, and a quill worn thin. "I sent word to the circuit preacher," Gideon said, his voice steady but nervous around the edges. "He'll be passing through in a few days' time." Florence brushed flour from her hands and stepped closer. "What for?" Gideon cleared his throat, looking almost shy. "Figured, if you want it, we could make things proper. Give Eliza a name folks can't question. Give you my name if you'll have it." Florence stared at him, her heart thudding so hard it almost hurt. She set Eliza down in her cradle and reached for his hand across the table. "I'd be proud to be your wife," she said, the words coming easy and sure. Relief and tenderness crossed Gideon's face and he squeezed her hand gently. "You and Eliza are already my family. Just want the rest of the world to see it." The preacher arrived 3 days later, riding a tired mule and carrying a Bible wrapped in oilcloth. Florence wore a dress she had let down and patched at the hem. Gideon had shaved and combed his hair, and he looked so handsome standing there that Florence could hardly keep her hands from trembling. The ceremony was simple, just the three of them and the preacher, with Eliza gurgling quietly in the cradle. When Gideon spoke his vows, his voice was rough but steady, and when he slipped the iron ring onto Florence's finger, his hands shook just a little. Florence repeated her vows without faltering, the words stitching themselves into her heart as surely as any seam she had ever sewn. When Gideon kissed her, it was slow and certain, a promise made flesh. That night, with the fire burning low and Eliza sleeping soundly, Florence rested her head against Gideon's chest. His hand traced lazy circles along her back, and she listened to the steady beat of his heart. "You sure you're content out here, with just me in this scrub of land?" he asked quietly. Florence tilted her head to look at him. "I've never been more certain of anything." Gideon smiled, not the quick kind he gave neighbors passing by, but something deeper, meant only for her. He shifted to pull her closer, careful not to disturb Eliza. "In a few weeks, we'll plant the first rows," he said. "Corn, beans, maybe some squash if we can barter for seed." "I can help," Florence said. "I know how to work a field." He chuckled low in his chest. "I don't doubt that." They talked late into the night, making plans for a small garden near the well, for a chicken coop built from old lumber stacked in the shed. Gideon wanted to carve a rocking chair for Florence to sit with Eliza in the evenings. Florence dreamed of making a braided rug for the hearth, of teaching Eliza to read when the time came. In the months that followed, they planted their fields and coaxed life from the stubborn earth. Florence learned the rhythm of the seasons in Wyoming territory, the sudden violence of spring storms, the long golden hush of summer dusk, the crisp, clean snap of autumn air. Neighbors rode in from distant homesteads, bringing baskets of preserves and rough-hewn gifts for the baby. Florence found herself welcomed into a community she had never dared hope for, her days filled with work and laughter and the steady, unwavering presence of Gideon at her side. Eliza grew strong and bright-eyed, toddling around the cabin on chubby legs by the second autumn. Gideon carved her a small wooden horse, and Florence stitched dresses from flour sackcloth, decorating them with careful embroidery. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the plains, Florence stood at the edge of the porch, watching Gideon hoist Eliza onto his shoulders as he walked the fence line. The wind tugged at her skirts, carrying the scent of sweetgrass and earth. Gideon caught her eye and lifted Eliza's tiny hand to wave. Florence waved back, her heart so full it almost hurt. She had found more than shelter here. She had found a life built not on desperation or fear, but on trust, kindness, and love. A life she had chosen freely one morning at a kitchen table with a man who had asked nothing of her but her heart. As the stars blinked to life overhead and Gideon carried their daughter back to the warm light spilling from the cabin door, Florence knew with a certainty deeper than words that she was exactly where she was meant to be. And she would be here with Gideon and Eliza for all the days to come.